For evaluation for lateralisation, there are two possible ways that you would have to approach it. You might be asked to evaluate the theory of lateralisation as a whole, so the idea that one hemisphere specialises in certain functions and the other hemisphere specialises in other functions. You might be asked to evaluate specifically Sperry's research itself, because Sperry is named on the spec. We'll start with lateralisation using spec evaluation points, where you are asked to evaluate the theory as a whole, and then we'll have a look at evaluating Sperry afterwards. So of course the easiest way to do lateralisation evaluation for supporting evidence, of course, would be to use Sperry as a piece of research. So Sperry is a supporting piece of research for lateralisation. So as always, a strength is that there is supporting evidence, for example, and then I would give a summary of Sperry, so Sperry's findings and how Sperry supports lateralisation theory. And then obviously your final point, your explain, is why is it a good thing to have supporting evidence in a theory. So the chunk of that evaluation point would be the example, and it would be talking about the findings of Sperry and then linking those findings back to lateralisation. So the example would be a huge chunk of that. And then you've got practical applications. So with this one here, it's a little bit different from normal. So this one, it's about the evolutionary explanation. So the practical applications of this theory is that it can practically be applied to the concept of evolution. So it is a bit of a tricky one to get your head around, but without having that one to try, we would struggle to use the spec structure to prompt your memory. So this can be applied to the evolutionary explanation, might be a way of viewing it. So it's a strength because the explanation can be linked to, can be applied to the evolutionary explanation as a whole. And then you could talk about Rogers, and I'm going to put a link in Moodle to Rogers' piece of research around chickens and the fact that a domestic chicken displays traits of lateralisation. So it has been found that whilst chickens are foraging for food, they're using one hemisphere to forage for the food, to look for it, the visual task, and then the other hemisphere is on the search for predators. So in case anybody is going to eat them, they can use the other hemisphere to keep an eye out to keep them safe. And as you can see, that would give a strong evolutionary advantage. So therefore the two theories are in support of each other. So lateralisation and evolution support each other, which of course increases the validity of both of the theories. You could have a however sentence, they're using chickens. So that's not a great example. Chickens' neural complexity, so how complicated their brain is very, very different to how complicated a human brain is. You could talk about generalizability, extrapolation issues in the however, but we would use it as a strength in the main body. Evaluation of methodology. So one of the key, most significant pieces of research that we look at is Sperry. So one of the problems is that the research relies on Sperry, which does have some flaws. For example, the sample size of only 11 people. You can go to town on that. You know all of the evaluation points. You should be really comfortable with that one because it's AS stuff we look at. So population validity, can it be generalised? Lots of different issues. Now, something that we touched on last week around quasi experiments, which this is one of them, is there's an issue with the control group in this one. So of course it's a quasi experiment because the IV is whether they experience split brain surgery or they didn't. The control group didn't experience it, but a problem was that there was no epilepsy in the control group. However, all of the people who had the split brain research had epilepsy and therefore had to have the surgery to control for that epilepsy. And this is what is called a confounding variable. I'm going to bring up a slide to support our understanding or recap our understanding of what a confounding variable is, which is a type of extraneous variable. So it will be fairly easy to explain issues with cause and effect, internal validity, and then linking that back to why that's a problem to the theory. So we've done all of that stuff at AS. This is just going to kind of cement your understanding of a confounding variable. So these slides will be familiar to you, and if you really struggle with this concept, I go into it in a lot more detail in session 2 of AS variables, and I would recommend for a lot of you it'd be really beneficial for you to have another look at that topic as revision. Okay, so this is something, the confounding variable is something that varies systematically with the IV. We also call it the alternative IV, so it's something that looks like an IV but isn't the IV, and we don't want it. So generally there are it only affects one condition or the other, or you only see it exclusively in one condition or the other, whereas extraneous variables happen at random. So for example, here you can see the DV we're looking at is the length of somebody's life, and the IV we want to see is if being a nurse or being a mechanic affects how long we live. However, because that is a quasi-experiment, because they're either nurses or mechanics, generally, stereotypically, you find that nurses are more female and mechanics are more male. So that's an alternative IV. It's not one not one we've planned for, but because we can't randomly allocate, that one has automatically already appeared. And as possibly some of you know, there is research that does support the idea that gender, so males generally don't live quite as long as females do for various different reasons. So it could look like whether you're a nurse or a mechanic is affecting the length of your life, but actually it's actually your gender. But because that varies systematically with the IV, gender varies at the same time as the IV. We get confounded results. We get results that have been affected. The same with the next one, which is the DV. So generally there has been research where it's found that moderate drinkers have improved health compared to non-drinkers. So that looks quite positive. That's where you get all these ridiculous newspaper headlines about drinking a glass of red wine a day helps with your heart or whatever. They are quasi-experiments. We can't make people drink more or less. We just ask them how much they drink and then measure their health. And a confounding variable with this one, not always, but generally quite a lot, and particularly not so much now, but previously in research, generally people who chose not to drink, a lot of them had a history of alcoholism. So of course their health is going to be impacted by that. So the only thing we were supposed to be looking at is whether they were moderate drinkers or non-drinkers. They were the two conditions. But within those two conditions there was another variable, another alternative IV, where most people who were moderate drinkers weren't alcoholics, and a lot of the non-drinkers had previously had problems with alcohol, hence why they weren't drinking now. So it could be that impacting their health as well. And another one example, IV and smoking and non-smoking and poverty, and we generally find that if you smoke, that you live in that you are more likely to have experienced poverty. Again, very stereotypically. More likely to experience poverty. So we go, right, so if you quit smoking you suddenly have loads and loads of money, which could be true, definitely. You'll have more income, but you won't suddenly magically necessarily get a pay rise or anything like that. And there's a confounding variable could be, generally we find that people who smoke, there's a link between education and smoking, and non-smoking and education, and a higher level of education. So it's a bit like an intervening variable within a correlation, but because it's experimental we can call it a confounding variable. So do go back and have a look at correlations as well for an intervening variable. So again, another IV, generally all the smokers are in condition 1 also would have a lower level of education, and generally all of the non-smokers would have a higher level of education, and we can't tease apart which one it is that it's affecting poverty or not. And again, same with football fans and non-football fans and spatial awareness. Oh, excellent. So we found that generally football fans, if we play football, then we get better at spatial awareness. Not necessarily. Generally, again, there's a gender split. So football fans, again, very stereotypically are male, and non-football fans are female. We're going with we're keeping concepts simple for that reason. I know that that's not the case always. But then we've got an additional IV that we don't want, so male and female groups, which we don't want in the sample. And so there is this one here. So the IV is split brain or non-split brain in Sperry's research, and that's looking at brain functioning, the response to stimulus, lateralisation. But there is also an alternative IV, another IV that has two conditions: epilepsy, which is in the split brain, and not having epilepsy, which is in the non-split brain. And that cannot be controlled for because we cannot randomly allocate. We can't take those 11 people or 22 people and randomly put them into right, you're split brain, you're not split brain, because they come in with that condition. And they are different to extraneous variables which have an effect at random. So the confounding variable, there's condition 1 and condition 2, and they're all grouped together, so all the epilepsy people in one condition and the no epilepsy in the control. However, with extraneous variables, age, for example, would be extraneous variable because that's scattered throughout. Some of the split brain patients might be old and some might be young. Some of the non-split brain patients might be old and they might be young, and gender would be scattered throughout. So extraneous variables impact the DV at random. Confounding variables systematically impact the DV. Okay, that is a really useful one to be aware of, so please do try and understand that one. Do a bit of reading around it, have a bit of a think, 'cause it is something that you can all understand and you can access in second year, but you just need to have a thought process about it and do your best. Okay, so another problem, of course, is there was in the control group there was no epilepsy, so the research did suffer from confounding variables which could lower our confidence in cause and effect and therefore impact the internal validity. What you must do, and think about how you did at AAS, is link it back. So one of the problems is that the theory relies on flawed research. Well, what impact does that have on the theory of lateralisation as a whole? And then finally, Turketel 2002. So this is an alternative theory, or you could even talk about it as an opposing piece of research if you wanted to, but it is just an alternative. Turk found that there was a patient who had damage in the left hemisphere of his brain, and as you know from localization, the language centers are in the left side of the brain, so technically when they were damaged he shouldn't be able to comprehend or produce speech. However, this person was able to do that because his right hemisphere had taken over. So lateralisation suggests that each hemisphere specialises in certain functions, and Turk's research does not support that. So have a think about why Turk's findings that there are people with language centres in the right side of the brain in response to brain damage, why that doesn't support lateralisation. And again, if there are alternative explanations, why does that go against why doesn't that support lateralisation theory? What impact does it have on the theory of lateralisation? Okay. The other one, so this is if the question was evaluate Sperry's research, and there is some questions, generally smaller ones. I think it would be less likely to get a 16 marker on this because it's not as complicated. So if you did, you'd be really, really lucky to get a 16 marker, and I don't think that they would give you a 16 marker. However, I have seen 4 markers that ask for evaluation points for Sperry's research, so you do need to be aware of it. And of course, if you've got loads and loads of time and a 16 marker about lateralisation, as long as you could always link it back, you can evaluate Sperry's research as well. So again, we're being a bit loose with the term spec here, so supporting evidence. So we've got the S for supporting. So something that supports Sperry's research is the fact that it used a very good standardised procedure, which would allow us to repeat that research. So there was a dot in the centre, and then that they had to look at when they were having the images flashed in. So that meant that the eyes didn't look, they didn't see a picture that was supposed to only go, say, be seen in the left eye, so go into the right hemisphere. They weren't able to do that. They weren't able to look away and look at it with both eyes. It went into both hemispheres. They had to look at the dot, and the dot was always in the same place. And and they also had the images flashed up for exactly the same length of time, so 1/10 of a second. You know all about standardised procedure. There's so much that you could write about why that's a positive. What does it increase the validity? What does it do to reliability? There's hundreds of things you could talk about there. Okay. Rogers with the chickens, you'd need to word it very, very carefully, but of course Sperry's research found support for lateralisation. There have been other areas that have also found support for lateralisation and can be applied as well. Apologies, with this one it does fall down a little bit with the structuring, so just remembering the 4 points, so I do apologise about that, but it is something that you can look at, and if you're not sure we can talk about it in session as well. Evaluation of methodology, so problems with the method. There was a small sample size, the control group was a problem as well. You could talk about those as individual points. So if you don't like the practical applications one, you could talk about sample size as being one problem and the control group and confounding variables being a second problem, the standardised procedure being a strength. And another problem is that there's a contrast alternative. There's some opposing research in Turk again, so the person whose left side of their left hemisphere was damaged and they were still able to produce speech because the right hemisphere took over. So how we link that back to lateralisation as well. Okay, and that is it. That you now should be able to evaluate lateralisation, and I will be asking you to have a go at that in the lesson next week. Lovely, thank you very much.